Good afternoon to all of you, also those who connected online for our next I3h reading seminar. I'm very pleased to introduce to you Dr. Khadidja Abdallah. She's a research scientist specialized in market access of pharmaceuticals with a focus on payment strategies and budget impact analysis for orphan drugs. She's driven by multidisciplinary collaboration to achieve sustainable access to treatment and care for all. Khadidja recently completed her doctoral studies at the Pharmaceutical Sciences Department at KU Leuven under the supervision of Professor Steven Simons, and she's currently searching for a job in health economics in the industry or consulting. She has been a visiting researcher at the Institute of Health Economics in Canada. She has been a research fellow at the Gaucher Institute in Geneva, and I'm really happy that she will present to you budget impact analysis and payment approaches for orphan drugs. Khadidja, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the nice introduction. Before I start, I want to ask a question to the public first. So looking at these two pictures, do you remember what it was about and what connection do you see between these two illustrations? Yeah.
Yes, the one on the right is about baby fear, SMA, a rare disease, right? And the parents were crowdfunding to get the money to afford Zolgensma.
Yeah.
And on the left, I know that it's about a rare disease as well.
Yeah,
but I'm not familiar with that one. So
yes. Okay. And do you remember why they did the ice bucket challenge or?
No.
No. Okay. Yeah, it's 10 years ago, but it went viral. So everyone on the internet was just like throwing an ice bucket over their head. And yeah, they challenged the next person to do it as well. And if you declined the challenge, you had to donate. But usually people did the challenge and then donated anyways. So both of them really relate to a rare disease. The first one was more to crowdfund for research into ALS, so amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, because there was almost no research in that area. And it was very successful. They collected hundreds of millions of dollars, and they were even able to bring one drug to the market in the US. However, it did get disapproved recently because it wasn't efficacious, the trials failed. And with the second one, baby Pia, indeed, it was for Zolgensma. At that time, the drug was available in the US, but not yet in the EU, which is also a challenge to access the drug if it's not approved here yet. And baby Pia was able to travel to the US and get the drug. And yeah, she's still here, so I guess that was also successful. And afterwards as well, the drug now is reimbursed in Belgium and of course approved in the EU. And they also have a newborn screening for SMA. So that was also very successful. However, usually I think most of rare diseases are not funded this way by engaging the public. Usually the government has to, they have to raise the funds and pay for the drug. So what challenges do they actually encounter when they have to fund orphan drugs? So my PhD was focused on the financial hurdles and intricacies that are involved in funding orphan drugs. And I focused on budget impact analysis and payment approaches, like Hilda introduced. And so now I'm going to present to you my PhD results. I was also supervised by Professor Steven Simons, Isabel Huis, and Kathleen Slaas. So what is an orphan drug? An orphan drug is a drug used for the treatment, diagnosis of or prevention of a serious or rare condition. The European Medicines Agency defines a rare condition as a disease that affects less than 1 in 2,000 people. It is to treat a life-threatening or chronically debilitating disease. And yeah, usually without incentive, there wouldn't really be any development in that area. However, if we look on a global scale, rare is not really that rare, because there's about 400 million people that are estimated to be living with a rare disease, and there's about 10,000 diseases that are currently identified. So this definition that I mentioned from the European Medicines Agency is part of the EU orphan regulation, which was introduced in 1999 to really increase or stimulate development in the rare disease area. So before this regulation, there was about 15 treatments or drugs that were used to treat rare diseases. But after this, let's say the 2000s, the development of orphan drugs really increased and surged. And currently there's about 231 orphan drugs that are approved by the European Medicines Agency, authorized in Europe. So when a drug is developed, so this is just a graph of very simplified of the drug life cycle. So at your left, you see the research and development stages where you talk about discovery, like in the lab, in the beginning. Then you go to the trials, clinical trial 1, 2, and 3. And this research and development stage can take up to 20 years. And when a pharmaceutical company is confident enough about their drug, they can go to the European Medicines Agency to ask for authorization of a drug or treatment in the EU. However, after they do that, before it reaches the patient, the company needs to go and knock on the member states' countries' doors individually and go through this pricing and reimbursement procedure to have their drug actually marketed on nationally within the countries. So, like we said before, before it reaches the patient, let me rephrase that. So there's a really big surge in orphan drug development now, but what we see now is that reaching the patient, so the drug going to the patient, is much harder. For example, in Belgium, only this is from 2022, about only 40% of the drugs that are approved, authorized for use in Europe, are approved within Belgium. So what goes on in this pricing and reimbursement procedure? Usually what a third payer within a country tries to do is gauge the value of the drug that a pharmaceutical company presents to them. So is this drug valuable enough to be marketed on in their country and at the price that they suggest? So what do they usually look at? They look at the legal implications of introducing the drug within their market, ethical implications, also social implications, but that's where they could ask the public or the patients, what do they think about having this drug? And then they look at clinical aspects. Here this is more like efficacy and safety of the drug, which is also looked at the EU level already. And then usually they perform health economic analyses. So another question for the public, based on what I said about orphan drugs and the characteristics, what can complicate the reimbursement of orphan drugs? What do you think about when I ask this?
Just less evidence.
Sorry?
Less evidence.
Yeah, less evidence. Okay.
Small population.
Yeah.
Great prices.
Okay. You had all of them, so the questions aren't very hard. Yeah. Exactly. So because the population is small, that means that in the R&D stages in the clinical trials, the drug is also tested on a small population. which means that usually when the drug is market authorized, there is still a lot of questions about, is this drug actually working? And is it efficacious? And also the costs of the drug, indeed. So the annual cost per person of an orphan drug is almost 5 times higher, on average 5 times higher than a non-orphan drug. And these elements are actually all very important for these health economic analyses that have to be performed. And my PhD really focused on budget impact analyses. And I'm going to explain what that is in a bit. But first of all, also another issue, not really an issue, but governments feel like, their budget share is more and more taken up by orphan drugs. So here you can see a depiction of in 2012, the increase of the expenses for orphan drug and non-specialty drugs in Belgium. So 340 million for orphan drugs, and non-orphan drugs was 3 billion, over 3 billion, almost 4 billion. But then we look at 2020, and we actually see that for both, that expenses increase, but it looks like orphan drugs, their expenses increase a lot faster than non-orphan drugs. So the question really is, like, we have infinite budgets. How do we keep affording these orphan drugs and giving patients that have also rights to these drugs access to them, with the bearing in mind that the budget is finite?
I have 2 questions.
Yeah.
First, when I look at the price of these orphan drugs, some are crazily expensive, but some are also very cheap.
Exactly.
It seems like they will use paracetamol to treat, you know what I mean? Like these super cheap, old genericized drugs, etc., which can be recycled, if I can use that term. And so do you know the distribution of these costs? Because it looks like some are new and super expensive, some are old and very cheap, actually.
Yeah.
And then second point, you showed that the number of drugs accepted exploded, was multiplied by 20, 30.
Yeah.
And the cost is multiplied by 1.9. So how do we relate these numbers?
Okay, so the first question, do you mean the drugs that are cheap when you refer to them, or just non-orphan drugs and orphan drugs shared?
To treat orphan diseases, some when you see these graphs of the cost per person, you have this explosion of prices for some drugs, but you have lots of points which are the bottom left, so few people, low price.
Yeah.
And I don't know what's in these graphs. So I see the points from papers. I don't see what's in these points.
Yeah. It depends also, because so I did say there's 231 drugs that are now approved for orphan drugs. And when I say orphan drug and they get the orphan drug status, they have a lot of incentives. They got like 10-year market access exclusivity. They get all these special treatments, but there's so many other drugs or diseases that don't have an officially recognized or approved drug. So they do treat them sometimes off-label, usually with other cheaper drugs. But what we see is sometimes when a pharmaceutical company sees that, or it's just known that this cheaper drug that is used for other diseases really works for these orphan, this rare disease, they can go with that same drug that was used for a lot of people. They can go back to the European Medicines Agency and get it approved. And then you can see also that's where the price really explodes sometimes. But it's not all of them that are very, very expensive like that. It's also, we have to factor in the fact that R&D takes that long. And
so this is why I'm insisting on these cheap drugs. an average can be composed of outliers which are crazily expensive,
yeah.
took 20 years, etc.
Yeah,
And a mass of drugs which cost next to zero.
yeah.
And so I just see these data points. I don't know how many of them, I don't know what they are.
Yeah.
And so
But,
that's why
yeah.
you don't seem to have the contents of these data points either.
I don't really know the numbers about it, but what really for my PhD I focus on is those drugs that are labeled as orphan drugs in the EU. And you can see for gene therapies, they're sometimes at like usually millions for one treatment, but then others are like in the range of 10,000 a month or like 500 a day. I'll talk about like cystic fibrosis in a second as well, and their disease modifying drugs. They're more in the category of like 10,000 a month, I guess. And then for sickle cell disease, which will also come here, they have also disease modifying, but also the gene therapy. And then you can see that the gene therapy.
There you're talking about these drugs which are, again, there is this mass of other drugs that go under the radar. We don't know a lot about them. That's why I was asking. Thank you.
I may follow up. You're saying that there are many drugs approved,
But
much fewer that are reimbursed and therefore reach patients. There is a budget constraint, of course, but are we sure that the EMA and the FDA are doing their job well in the following sense? Maybe they are facing a lot of pressure from the companies to get an authorization, and they say, okay, it doesn't cost us anything, so we authorize, and then the problem goes to the member states. Is that a potential problem?
So actually, you touched upon a point that I also discussed in my thesis. So maybe we can have that for later, or okay. It's literally the last slide about my discussion.
Okay.
Okay.
I'll be patient.
So yeah, my PhD does focus on these two aspects. So first, we want to know how to determine a budget impact for an orphan drug, knowing that there are these challenges. So a budget impact analysis is part of many health economic analyses. You probably know the cost effectiveness analysis, but much more research was known about cost effectiveness analysis. So we wanted to really focus on budget impact. So it's in the next slide, I'll explain what it's about. So budget impact analysis is used to determine the affordability of a health intervention, which in this case, we will focus on pharmaceuticals and orphan drugs. And it looks at within a healthcare system, so let's say Belgium, for a particular disease, which drugs are used and how many patients are treated, what other equipment do they need, or does it have to be in a hospital setting? So all the costs that are involved or attached to the treatment of a rare disease are just all the costs that are associated are just calculated, and an estimate is made about how much it costs to actually treat the rare disease now, and then it looks at how much these costs would change, usually on a short-term time horizon, so 1 to 5 years is usually used. So how much do these costs change in each year when a new treatment is introduced? So then what then a budget impact is you take the costs that are now added to the treatment of this disease in the new world, minus the costs that were currently associated to treating the disease. So this difference in cost is called a budget impact. So the second question, problem statement in my thesis was, so how do we sustainably pay for these orphan drugs in light of the budget constraints. So for example, the example of baby Pia, Zolgensma is now reimbursed, but likely, very likely, there's other factors in play that were, for example, the media attention, maybe that accelerated the process of it being reimbursed. So is it really sustainable? I mean, baby Pia is quite exceptional, but is it sustainable to really keep funding these drugs in the long run? And how do we do that? Are there special payment approaches, or do we have to like look at this differently? So I focused on 5 work packages in my thesis. So there's 5 of them, and I'll go into them like one by one. If you have any questions, you can also still interrupt me. So in the first study, we first wanted to map out back then the budget impact analysis that currently existed for orphan drugs and how they were performed methodologically. And we therefore performed a systematic literature review. I identified at first more than 1,000 articles, but also mostly abstracts, because there was honestly not so much information about orphan drugs and budget impact analysis. And then we selected about 90 studies that we looked at. So the guidelines that we used to gauge the quality of the budget impact analysis were stemmed from ISPOR, which is the Health Economic Society, International Health Economic and Outcomes Research Society. And there's about 11 parameters that they talk about when you want to make a budget impact analysis. Here I've just listed what it's supposed to be. So for example, the perspective, it should be the third payer perspective and not societal perspective. The target population over the 5 years needs to be open and dynamic, meaning that in some years there will be more patients treated, some people might also die, and like, so that dynamic relationship in those years should be accounted for. So the costs that are displayed in the tables for this analysis should be disaggregated over the 5 years. We have to look at market effects. So what happens to the market when the drug is accepted? So will it be a substitute to a current treatment? Will it be combined with it, or just expand the current market? So all of this, it has a lot of cost associated with it. And I think I'm gonna just point out 2 others, because otherwise it's a bit much. But one important thing is also to look at, not only look at drug costs, but also the associated costs related to the drug use. Like I said, if it's in a hospital setting, and for example, if you need more staff, and all of these things that are directly related to using the drug should be also accounted for. So if you want more information of every aspect, I have a paper published on it, but let's move on. So what did we see when we looked at the budget impact analysis that were published? Is that, let's say for 4 parameters, most articles were within the acceptable range, or they followed the guidelines. But for all the rest, they were either not reported, for example, the market effect, or the target population was closed, so they only looked at 5 people or like 10 people across the 5 years of the analysis. Also, usually they only account for only drug-only costs, so only the drug of the cost, so not the associated costs. And yeah, let's see. Okay. So we could conclude largely that at that time, and probably currently still, there's a lack of methodological rigor in existing budget impact analyses, specifically for orphan drugs. So this might be influenced by, like we talked about, the missing clinical data on efficacy that most likely influence the quality of the budget impacts. So overall, what we could say of those existing budget impact analyses, so are they really reliable to then make conclusions for reimbursement? Because guidelines usually weren't followed. And I also concluded that forecasting affordability with budget impact analysis, which can be a powerful tool, is insufficiently exploited in the field of orphan drugs the right way. So in my next study, I wanted to see if can we actually perform a budget impact analysis following these guidelines that are set up. And so therefore, we conducted a budget impact analysis ourselves, and we focused on sickle cell disease, which is a blood inherited disorder that is genetic. And basically, people who don't have sickle cell disease have hemoglobin A, but when you are affected by this genetic mutation, people usually have HbSS, hemoglobin SS. So their red blood cells are sickle formed, and that comes with a lot of complications. The most common one is vaso-occlusive crises. So at that time, there were like 3 new treatments that were still being approved or used compassionately. So for the budget impact analysis, to conduct this one, we first looked at literature, what is available on how these patients are currently treated. And here we specifically focus on Belgium. And we saw that the patients are either on hydroxyurea, which is a fetal hemoglobin inducer. They're either treated with transfusions, and some have had hematopoietic stem cell transplantation. And then for the new drugs, we focus on Vexelator, which is a treatment that is chronic treatment, and it's taken at home, and it inhibits the HbS polymerization, which then prevents sickling of this hemoglobin and increases hemoglobin levels. Then we also looked at crizanlizumab. I must say that this drug is now taken off the market in Europe, but at the time was more used in compassionate use. So it's an antibody which was able to block P-selectin and prevented those crises that I talked about, and is a chronic treatment that was used in hospitalization context. And then we also looked at a gene therapy, CTX001, which is the first gene therapy that now is approved using CRISPR-Cas. Maybe you've heard of it as well. This gene therapy is able to block this gene that prevents us to have fetal hemoglobin. So when we are born, we have mostly fetal hemoglobin, and after 1 year, 2 years, that one changes to adult hemoglobin. So this gene therapy is able to block this gene that is responsible for this change in adult hemoglobin, and then reactivates actually the levels of fetal hemoglobin, so that these patients are protected from the sickle-formed hemoglobin. And it is a one-time treatment, gene therapy, technically, and it's used in hospital settings. So we looked, so in the budget impact analysis, we had a 5-year budget impact analysis, and then we gauged what the budget impact was. We estimated looking at the drug cost, but also really trying to follow the guidelines that I talked about earlier. And we saw that over 5 years, I must also say that currently our estimate to treat sickle cell disease was around 9 million. And with these new treatments, if after 5 years they are approved, all of them, the budget impact would be around 40 million. And then we also did some scenario analyses, because at the time I did the study, it was likely that crizanlizumab would be taken off the market. And we saw that it didn't really change much for the scenario for the budget impact. So that's scenario 1. And then we also looked at if we gradually looked at if more people would be on the treatment. So at first we looked at 10%, and then in the third scenario, we looked at if 18% of people would be treated. And then you see that really if, let's say 18% of people with sickle cell disease are treated with any of these drugs, the budget impact goes up to about 140 million. And that's specifically for Belgium.
We have a question from Nathalie Tibé, who's a biomedical student, that you will be, do these treatments need to be taken together? I imagine basically there's the one not so sure, but the others, how do they relate to each other?
So for voxelotor and crizanlizumab, they were always taken with hydroxyurea, because that's the standards. Yeah, it was mostly in combination with hydroxyurea. Yeah, I must also say for this analysis, I didn't show it here, but in my Excel table, I gradually made the drugs available. So in year 1, I looked at crizanlizumab and voxelotor, but the gene therapy I estimated to be on the market from year 3. So when you read the paper, you can see also the details on that.
And is it the same dose for the life, or does it increase?
When you talk about a specific
The transplantation, the hydroxyurea.
Hydroxyurea, I know that usually they have to increase the dose. Also, because in the beginning it's hard to know which dose is specific, is needed for the drug and good for the patient. So they kind of increase the dose. For voxelotor, I remember that they just have guidelines, the leaflet says so many tablets per day. I can't really remember the specifics because it's been so long. But sometimes I have to increase the drug. And I also try to include in my analysis the percentages of people that are on the drug. Also, I forgot to mention very important. So I did try to do this analysis by myself first, looking at literature, but a lot of information I didn't have. So we had to do a Delphi study and ask specialist hematologists to confirm the data that I put in my analysis, or just provide us with the data that we didn't have. That was very important for this, because without it, it was almost impossible. So the budget impact for these treatments is on the short term relatively high, and especially due to the gene therapy being introduced. So likely governments should look at alternative contracting methods to have these drugs available to their patients. And then to my question, if it was possible to do a budget impact analysis correctly for orphan drugs, it was feasible, but I must say it was very, very difficult. And there was so much. Why was it difficult? Because there was a lot of uncertainty. Even when we asked the experts, sometimes they didn't agree. So we had to look for the average in their answers. And that's why it's very important to have these scenario and sensitivity analyses, because it just depends, for example, how many patients would use the drug. So really having the experts there to perform a budget impact analysis is important for orphan drugs. So my second study on sickle cell disease, for this one, we wanted to determine the value of these new therapies that I talked about and compare to the current therapies, but use this method called multi-criteria decision analysis that in literature is suggested to use in the context of rare diseases. So what is a multi-criteria decision analysis? So in this analysis, you present a set of criteria, which I'll go in depth in the next slide, to experts or your stakeholder group. They have to weigh these criteria based on how important they think they are. And then you present in a second step the treatments, and based on the criteria that they selected, they have to kind of score how well these treatments do based on the criteria. And then you have the formula here. When you multiply these two factors, you have this one value that you can then rank. That based on this value, you can rank the treatment, so higher to lower value, or higher number you have. Okay. So for this one, we performed focus group discussions and included also France and England for the study, because some of the treatments the newer treatments were used already. For example, in the UK, crizanlizumab, I think at the time was approved. So they might have had more experience, and also in Europe, there is a higher population that has sickle cell in France and in England. So we also included these two countries, and we had in the focus group discussions hematologists, but also sociologists, hospital pharmacists, patients themselves. So we tried really to have a heterogeneous group to see if the opinions were different. So going into the MCDA, because just to clarify, the criteria that I presented to the stakeholders are depicted on your left. And they actually all got an evidence matrix or just an information brochure where I stated, okay, these are the criteria and this is what they mean. Can you weigh in terms of what you think is important to include when there's a reimbursement decision for a rare disease? What aspects do you think are more important to include in these decisions? And then I asked them to weigh them according to most important ones. And then, like I said, we looked at the current treatments, hydroxyurea and stem cell transplantation, and also the newer treatments. And they also got a table where I explained the drug and the characteristics and what it was about and trial data. So hopefully, I mean, they were able to score them based on how well they performed on the criteria. So they could score from 1 to 5 in order of how well they performed based on the criteria. So we had lots of numbers, but we then multiplied the weights and the scores. And then at the end, we added all the weighted scores and had one number or one value for each treatment. So then what was our results? For the first part, the most important criteria that stakeholders thought to generally include is severity, especially for any disease actually, efficacy and safety, which is also looked at on the level of the EU. But then we noted that more quantitative values analyses, but here we just depicted the cost, was least important for most. And then rarity of a disease wasn't really thought as that important to include in this discussions. And broader consequences here, we talk about if the patient is able to contribute to society because they can function better, for example, through work, or just contribute to the economic system of society, was also not seen as very important. And then for the drugs individually, I must specify as well, we had two different focus group types. Just we had French and Belgian stakeholders in one specific focus group discussion, because they have a more similar healthcare system, and we looked at English stakeholders in another focus group discussions. But for French and Belgian stakeholders, they preferred the less invasive treatments the most, and hydroxyurea, which is a drug that is used for multiple decades now, was still the most valued one. And then if we ask the English stakeholders, they valued the most known, or the established treatments for sickle cell disease currently the most. So they didn't really, they valued those more than the newer treatments.
Can I ask you if this is due to at this point you did a study, the uncertainties with respect to the gene therapy and potentially the fear of?
Gene therapy, especially for if we ask patients. In my table, the evidence matrix, I talked about this specific one, but I also mentioned the other gene therapies in the pipeline. And then if they read that in one, for not this one, but the other gene therapy, there was one patient that died in the trial. When they saw that, they immediately said like, no. But
did you also show the success of?
Of course. But then for them, they immediately related it to the gene therapy, although for that trial, they said that it probably wasn't related to that. But just the fact that that could be a potential consequence, they were like, no. But then if you ask like clinicians that are more familiar with these trials, and some, I think, I'm not sure, but I think one of them already was involved in the clinical trials, and then or with the other drugs, and saw the effects of the drugs. It really depended for clinicians on their own experience. For example, crizanlizumab, that is now not approved anymore. Some hematologists said that for some it really changed their life, and then others were like, this never worked. So so it was very different opinions depending on the person that voiced it. Here I only showed the results of the numbers, but in the paper I really tried to contextualize also the values that we got.
When you say cost is not that important. It also
But-
depends on how you ask the question. I mean, do I save baby here or do I feed the starving children? I mean, or somebody will pay, but not you or me.
Then in that aspect, there was someone who was involved in reimbursement dossier. And they could more, have that question more in mind. But like a patient that has a rare disease, will automatically mostly say it's not important. Also, in the UK stakeholders, the physicians there, so they have the NHS there, so all the drugs that they treat the patients with are free. So they don't have any idea of how much it actually costs. So some of the numbers, some physicians were really shocked that, oh wow, this costs this much, and I just prescribed like that. So they're not very conscious of how much it costs. But that was specifically the UK. But it was interesting. Our conclusion, although hydroxyurea, which is the standard of care, is currently still favored, it was probably mostly influenced by the fact that they know a lot more about it. I think it's been in use for like 60 years now. But they were still of the opinion that there's a lack of optimal therapies to treat this disease, and there's a need for tailored advancements and treatments. So just to comment on the exercise, it was very important to have these different stakeholders' perspectives to really have this nuanced appraisal of the treatments. And this multi-criteria decision analysis was not, let's say, the golden way of handling it, but it just really provided with the structured approach to really holistically look at the treatments that is very important in orphan drugs, because usually if you just look at cost effectiveness analysis with the price that it has, if you were just to look at that, most drugs won't pass the test. But decision making was still very complex because people had different opinions. There was still a lot of uncertainty. Going on to the second part of my PhD, which was focused on payment approaches. For this third work package, I looked at we tried to evaluate alternative payment methods and access schemes for orphan drugs, and did that on the basis of focus group discussions. So we brought together, again, a whole range of stakeholders, representatives from the Orphan Drug College, the reimbursement committee of Belgium, also industry representatives, physicians, ethicists, and pharmacists. So really try to have a very diverse group. And we looked at, and we asked them to evaluate these two methods that aren't currently used in Belgium just to reimburse orphan drugs, so insulated orphan drug, orphan drug fund. So this fund would be just to set apart a budget to reimburse orphan drugs. Should Belgium have this separate fund just for orphan drugs? And the private insurance, which is mostly used in the US and Canada to pay or reimburse treatments. Yeah, in Belgium, it's just a very small part of the healthcare system, but not the major one. So should orphan drugs be funded only through private insurance? So I just depicted two perspectives. The first one on insulated orphan drug fund. This physician said that rare diseases, it is such a mixed population with variations of pathologies. And for rare diseases and their therapies, there are often many uncertainties, which we also talked about earlier. These are two main elements that you should cover. And it would be very challenging with something that is fixed for 10 years, so fixed budgets. You always need something dynamic. And then on private insurances, an ethicist said that there would be decent public health care, but the moment it becomes expensive and inaccessible, it would be handed over to private insurance and making it accessible to only those who can afford it or who are administratively resilient enough to arrange it. So these two new alternative methods weren't very popular. So we also asked them, okay, let's look at the current systems in place that are also used to gain access to these treatments in Belgium. So we looked at the emergency fund, special, also called Special Solidarity Fund in Belgium. And it's a fund that is not only used for orphan drugs, but also other treatments. And a representative from the Drug Reimbursement Committee said that this fund should remain an exception. It is case by case, so not for everyone with a rare disease. And it's to answer needs when there is no structural solution. or to give access to medicines that are not yet registered. For adults, also, the costs are never fully covered, and it's also limited. When we asked them about early treatment access, so compassionate use or the medical need program, these are programs that are able to give a patient access to a treatment that hasn't been, let's say, reimbursed in Belgium yet, or is in a late phase clinical trial, often funded also by the company. So a doctor said that as of yet, there has been in Belgium a problem with data collection of these programs. There are confidential issues involved, and also prescribers do not want to go through the trouble of collecting data, and companies certainly do not want to go through all of the administrations. So these programs are available, but they're not very efficient at the moment. And also with this early treatment access, there is also a possibility for a company to ask for reimbursement of them funding a patient having access to a treatment through this program. But so an industry representative said about this reimbursement, possible reimbursement, the idea of the amount that they get reimbursed is to cover the logistic costs, and the amount is relatively low. So they would likely improve the reimbursement and make it more appealing, because now it's just relatively burdensome and it doesn't bring much more to these compassionate use programs. And then we also looked at off-label use. Like I said, there are still many diseases that don't have treatments and are treated with other drugs that are used in other indications, but are not officially recognized to treat the patients in that indication. So an industry representative again said that I think there should be partial responsibility between authorities and companies, and really they have to think about shared responsibility for financing. So now the doctor is completely dependent on the goodwill of the company, and some companies are more willing to participate than others. So yeah, I just brought together some quotes which generally depicted the feelings of the stakeholders involved. But then what we could generally conclude is that stakeholders were not fan of this alternative payment methods to really just rely on that to fund orphan drugs. For the insulated orphan drug, they just said it would just reproduce the current issues that they face in the general reimbursement system. Is just on a smaller level. And for private insurance, there's a very high risk that is profit driven, and both are actually against the solidarity principle that Belgium really relies on to treat patients overall. So they didn't really endorse these new options, but they said a lot of they sent a lot of comments about how to improve current funding of orphan drugs within the general reimbursement system. For example, the data collection. So yeah, what data is collected should be really defined before, for example, starting a compassionate use program, so that at the end of a trial, they have the data that they really wanted in the beginning. So really define that. They also said it would be very good to collaborate in expert centers. For example, have rare diseases treated in only 3 expert centers in Belgium. So it's easier to collect the data again and have meet the specific endpoints. Then administrative burden for the early treatment access should be really simplified. And for off-label use, to make it more secure and appealing, there should be a legal framework that really defines, okay, who is responsible for what and who does the financing, because usually off-label use is not reimbursed. Yeah, so these are some suggestions that were made. And then the fourth study was a case study on cystic fibrosis, which is also a genetic disorder that is caused by a mutation in the CFTR gene and can affect lung function and many other organs, leading to failure and yeah, could lead to early death as well. So we looked at CFTR modulator medicines, which were new drugs that were introduced for treating cystic fibrosis, but were really disease modifying. So really targeting this CFTR protein, the mechanism of cystic fibrosis. So we did a literature review to really look at price and reimbursement. So how are these drugs reimbursed and accessed in 12 European countries? I put down all the flags there. And for the UK, we looked at the 4 separate countries. And for this study, we looked at Kalydeco, Symkevi, and Orkambi. There is also Kaftrio, but at the time it wasn't reimbursed yet. So there was almost no public information on it. So that's why I focused on these 3. And through the literature study, we tried to find information on the list prices, budget impact analyses, cost effectiveness analyses, and see through which arrangements these drugs were available. So the results show that for all 3 drugs in these 12 countries, the cost per day was around 500 euros. But then if we looked at, for example, France and compared the drug prices for the 3 drugs, yeah, individually, we could see that Kalydeco was more expensive, generally, then followed by Orkambi and then Symkevi, probably because Kalydeco was the first to be approved. And then Orkambi and Symkevi were 2nd and 3rd generation drugs. So if you have another drug already to treat patients, and I think also they are used in combination with Kalydeco, you have a less higher unmet medical need. So at the time when Kalydeco came on the market, there was no other drug that really modified the disease mechanism.
Can I ask how much time is between Kalydeco and Orkambi and Kalydeco and then Symkevi?
Yeah, I'll show you a timeline just later. So, okay. So for the ICER here, I just depicted cost effectiveness results for Scotland, because they're for all the 3 treatments and all the indications, the information was just publicly available. And there you can really see that the ICER, so cost per quality adjusted life years, was hundreds of millions, so 600,000, sorry, for Kalydeco in the first indication, then Orkambi 256,000, and then Symkevi for the first indication 500,000. Scotland usually uses a threshold to gauge if a drug is cost effective, and their threshold normally is 20,000 per quali. So you can really see that it's over that one. And they also have an adjustment for rare diseases, orphan drugs, where the threshold is slightly higher, like 50,000 per quali, but still, yeah, the ICER did not meet the threshold. And that was actually the case in most of the countries. I think all of the countries I studied, and they all decided that these treatments were not cost effective. And then if we looked at budget impact analysis, here it was a bit more difficult to really compare the outcome, the budget impact between countries, because in some countries there's a lot more patients. So for example, in Belgium, there's 6 pediatric patients, and then in the Netherlands, there's a lot more. But here, still in their reports, health technology assessment reports, all countries came to the conclusion that the budget impact was very high. So this is a timeline. So you can see Kaleido was authorized in 2012, Orkambi 2015, and then Synkevi in 2018. And I tried to put down the countries at what stage they reimbursed all of the treatments. So in Ireland, actually, they reimbursed, they had this portfolio deal agreement where they agreed with the company to fund all the treatment that they would bring that they would bring on the market for cystic fibrosis. So they already agreed, for example, in 2017 also to fund Synkevi, because even though it wasn't on the market yet, because in their portfolio deal, they agreed to all the treatments in the pipeline. And then maybe Belgium in 2021, this is just the stage where all these treatments were reimbursed. So I think in 2018, that's where they finally reimbursed Kaleido. So it took like 6 years for them, or Orkambi, sorry, to reimburse it. So you can see that it's not all the countries at the same time that have the drugs on their markets, even though it's authorized in the EU. So Ireland had the portfolio deal agreement, also Sweden, Denmark, England, Northern Ireland, and Wales. But the other countries decided to have this other type of contract, a managed entry agreement. So Austria, Belgium, France, Germany, Spain, Switzerland, and the Netherlands. And that's
You just said that all the countries agree that these drugs are not worth it.
yeah.
But they all agree to it.
Yeah.
And nobody revokes the.
Yeah, so that's my conclusion actually. So you can see that even though budget impact and cost effective, budget impact was very high and cost effectiveness, they didn't, they still reimbursed it. So probably contextual factors were at play. For example, prevalence in Ireland, the highest population of people with cystic fibrosis live there. Probably also they have very good patient organizations in each country. So also some say they're funded by pharma or like they get a bit, but lobbying and advocacy and severity also is just this contextual factor that we looked at a bit in the MCDA exercise. If you remember, really probably had a lot to do, because at this moment all the drugs are reimbursed in the 12 countries except for Sweden that only has Orkambi on the market. So okay, and then for my
just to be sure, for those time there are big discrepancies between official price and factory. What about those drugs?
So even the prices that I showed you were all list prices, and so we don't actually know what they actually pay because it's confidential. That's why they have these agreements. And it also depends on how well they can negotiate. So it's not very clear what the actual price they pay.
It might be a limitation in the interpretation of the discrepancies.
I think you almost always have this with these kind of studies because it's just confidential.
Okay. Thank you.
And then for the last study, we looked at disinvestment of orphan drugs. So what if for a rare disease, let's say after this managed entry agreement, which is a contract that says, okay, we're not very sure on efficacy of this drug, but for 3 years we allow this drug to be on the market, but after these 3 years we have to come back and see if the questions we had on efficacy are solved. What if after these 3 years, usually which is the case, the conditions were not met, and the government decides to, okay, we have to disinvest or not fund this, not reimburse this drug anymore on the market. It hasn't yet happened for orphan diseases, for rare or orphan drugs, but it should technically be a possibility because keep reimbursing a drug that doesn't really work. Remember there's budget constraints, it's not sustainable in the long run. So we wanted to provide stakeholders or decision makers and policy makers with a really good communication strategy on how to tackle that in the future. And for that,
Excuse me?
Yeah.
So you say that with orphan drugs, no drug introduced under a managed entry agreement has yet been stopped.
yeah, no,
Ever.
yeah, yeah.
Ever. That's interesting.
Usually they just reinstate a new managed entry agreement for 3 years. That's, yeah, my colleague actually really delved deep into that, but yeah, they just renew the contract. So we went through literature again to see if there's information on that. For orphan drugs, like I said, it's not done yet. So we looked at non-orphan drugs mostly, and then we had our set of questions and again had focus group discussions with Belgian stakeholders. So very, very wide range of stakeholders again, so representative of reimbursement committees, associates, pharmacists, industry. Really, that was the, throughout my PhD, I really wanted to have this multidisciplinary perspective. And then we tried to work together to come up with this strategy on how to really communicate this. Maybe I should say also how we know, because we know that it's mostly sensitive to, let's say, decide to just not reimburse a drug for like 3 patients that really need it. So if it doesn't work and you don't have a plan to like communicate it to them, it's very difficult also to just stop reimbursing it. So how do we handle that? So this is just an overview of the steps that we came up with. In the first step, I'll go into detail in each of them. So firstly, prepare a Belgian reassessment report, which just gathers evidence of disinvestment. Then in the second step, discuss and complete a communication guide. In the third step, inform the relevant stakeholders. In the fourth step, communicate to the patient. And the fifth step, then you publish an official statement. It was in the focus group sessions, the stakeholders said that this communication really has to be done efficiently and also not too long. So let's say, it was very difficult to come to an answer on how long this process should last, but as fast as possible, but also efficient as possible. We came to like 21 days. And in the title, I wrote down that it should be welcome, coordinated, substantiated. So what was the reason? And the patient really has to be put in the center in each step because it's about them at the end of the day. So in our first step, we went from the premise of there is a final disinvestment decision made by the Minister of Health. We did not try to, we just went from the premise that their decision was made on right grounds. So we didn't want to question that, and we moved on from that. And the manufacturer is also informed of the disinvestment decision. So in the first step, we said that a Belgian reassessment report or an evidence report should be made by a RISIF or NISD specialist that really documents very well the evidence on, okay, so why do we disinvest this drug? Okay, that shouldn't take more than 3 days. Then the second step would be that the NISD RISIF expert, so at the top, brings together other stakeholders to really come with a communication guide, who has which roles in communicating the message, and making a summary or a layman report of this evidence, the evidence report in the first step. So we talked about having treating physicians there. If there's no reference center with a treating physician, there's other options as well. So College for Genetics and Rare Diseases or Council for Rare Diseases of Functional Health Hospitals. There should be a scientific writer, a specialist writer present during the focus group discussion. A patient organization representative or experts patient if a rare disease area doesn't have an organized or professional organization, and of course industry representatives or manufacturer representatives.
So why should there be a manufacturer representative if it's a drug that doesn't work?
Because
they have a legal conflict of interest.
Yeah, but
somehow they're always there, or with their high-paid lobbyists. What is this?
Yeah, but they should be, because they should
they
kind of
control the system.
agree. No, they should kind of agree what is said to, publicly disseminated and also to the patient. But yeah, in that stage, they shouldn't be discussing if this is a right decision or not. It's just the purpose is to have this communication guide for the patient.
Okay.
So that shouldn't take more than 5 days. Yeah. And then in a third step, this is where we focus on dissemination of the communication letter and the summary of the evidence to those who should be able to convey a message to the patient personally. So the RISIF expert or NISD expert should inform the sickness funds or local pharmacists, because sometimes the patient may, let's say, go to their treating physician and then they go to a pharmacy to get it or just discuss why the drug is not there. And then, they should be able to convey the same message that they got from their physician. And of course, the treating physician is the person that should convey the message to the patient. Or sometimes when they're treated in an expert center, they have a multidisciplinary team where there's nurses and pharmacists, and all of these people should be able to convey the right and the same message. So they should get the communication letter and the summary of the evidence. That shouldn't take more than 3 days, informing the relevant stakeholders. And then in a fourth step, that's where we communicate to the patient. This depends on if it's a small patient group or a larger patient group. So cystic fibrosis is quite large, so it would be difficult for them to have the information at the same time from their treating physician. So in scenario A, small patient group, the physician and the multidisciplinary team should convey this message personally in consultation, because would be easier if there's only 3 patients. And in case of a large patient group, this is where the reference center and the professional patient organization and sickness funds should be able to convey the message via video teleconference or an in-person info session where patients can ask questions, and there could be this conveying of the disinvestment message. Here for this one, we gave them like 1 week. And then at the end, so first of all, the patient should be informed, and that's when only you publish the statement to the public and officially. So for that, the NIFTY website should be updated with the communication letter and the summary reports. And the letter and the report can also be disseminated to patient organizations or the BCFE or FAC. This is all done by the RISIF coordinator. And then this last part, we also found that it's still, that last part was more like to mitigate, let's say, for other rare diseases, for other diseases, sometimes usually when, for example, it's not reimbursed, there's a media uproar, and to really try to, it's impossible, but to avoid that maybe, it would be nice to have the Ministry of Health or their representative have this press release to the media. And this is about 3 days. So that were the 5 studies. There's some recommendations that I made. I won't go into depth. I can always send you my thesis, but the fourth one, throughout my whole PhD, I really think it was very important to have an improvement of data collection, both at national level, but also EU level. So not only have that really be done at national level. Also, it would be interesting to look at the price, to really focus on what is a fair price, and to maybe get that fair price. It would be nice if there's a shift from reference pricing, but to more collective negotiations, which is currently already there's some initiatives like Beneluxa. Then it's also very important to holistically define what is unmet medical needs to ensure that accessibility to orphan drugs is possible for those that are underserved. For budget impact analysis, there should be a template for pharmaceutical companies that they can just put their data in. So there you can really see, for example, if they didn't put one number, they can't submit it. And then also very important, it's important to have this multidisciplinary team to talk about the reimbursement, but it's also important to educate people who are present in those discussions, clinicians and patient experts, especially for example, in the focus group discussions for the MCDA. Sometimes it was very hard to have the patient really understand what a number meant, but also clinicians for the budget impact analyses, they weren't really, not all of them knew the concept of it. So sometimes when I asked them to make a prediction for like how many patients do you think will use this drug, it was more theoretically than the actual fact. So sometimes they would say, no, this is wrong, but it's more an estimate. And then the last point is an encouragement to policy decision makers to disinvest high cost and ineffective orphan drugs after conditional reimbursement if they don't meet the conditions set up before the agreement, instead of just renewing it. So that's that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Khadidja. Could you maybe leave the last slide with your recommendations on? Because
Okay.
I think that there were already some, I would say, thoughts or thought-provoking discussion online. I think with respect to the need to improve data collection at both national and EU level, I'm sure that the improved incentivizing of European reference networks as
Yeah.
proposed now in the new package, I think that this is a step forward. And I'm sure that, for example, we have a comment from Mark Jones online, maybe he can, he can comment on that. But we also have Ann Hendricks, I think, who had a remark, so don't hesitate to raise your hand if you have questions. Maybe, Matthias, you had a...
I've already asked quite some questions.
Yeah. Thank you.
Mark, if you have questions or remarks?
Sorry, I'm just briefly in a meeting now, so maybe in 5 minutes. Sorry.
Okay.
Sorry.
Mike?
Ja, dus ik wilde gewoon, so I only wanted to give an example of a very cheap orphan drug. So cheap orphan drugs really do exist. And then I gave the reference to our article on the material that Khadidja explained on CTFR, cystic fibrosis drugs. And then another thing which I think is very important is that it will be very difficult to explain to patients to stop the medication because it does not work. Most of them will not believe it.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe I should specify as well. So this investment guide is a guide. So it can be adapted. But we talked about an extinction scenario where there's the patients that are using the drug can still stay on it, but new patients wouldn't get the treatment. But even there, you have to be able to explain to these other patients why usually they know each other from the patient organizations, why this other patient is able to have it and they don't. So even there, like, communication is very important.
Exactly.
Regarding this communication, how would you communicate that indeed for marketing? It means that there has been a phase 3 trial which was positive, and still after additional investigation, it was found not to be effective. How would you explain that?
So that's also a point that came forward in the discussions. It would be the ideal situation is that all the countries collectively that have this drug on the market decide on, have the same conclusions and collectively disinvest. But yeah, because they could just say, yeah, but in England they still have it, so why don't we have it? So it's very hard to work that way because, of course, each country, I think Matt mentioned that a lot, but in Dutch, like, the EU is in Lappendeken with their own systems and rules and everything, so it would be hard to, like, collectively decide on that. But that's why this evidence letter really has to be clear as well, so that they understand that there is no added benefits.
One important point, which is somehow delicate to explain, is that when you have a phase 3 trial, even if with large number of patients, there are very strict criteria of inclusion and exclusion.
Exactly.
And this is decided by the company, which wants obviously to maximize the chance to have a significant result at the end. Whether in the real world, those criteria are not
I might comment on that as well, because, for example, the cystic fibrosis drugs in the HTA reports of many countries, they still didn't agree if lung function actually improves significantly, whereas that's maybe the most important. But yeah.
If I may, a provocative
Okay, go ahead.
question. If we never manage to disinvest, should we stop talking about managed entry agreements? Because they are unmanaged.
Yeah.
At some level, I mean, as I say, I mean, because I'm sure that whether it's managed entry or whether it's regular authorization, when something really bad happens, we disinvest, of course.
Yeah.
So in that sense, what's the value added of managed beyond the fact that you authorize more?
Yeah, that's a lot of researchers or scientists say that it's just a band-aid solution for a problem that doesn't get resolved. But yeah, that's why also, I mean, I don't know, I don't want to say that we failed in providing this new payment approach, but really also actually when I went to Canada as well, we are trying to have this paper published where for a different type of orphan drug or expensive drug for rare disease, which type of contract method is best used for it. So really tailor to each drug. So maybe that could alleviate that problem. But yeah, a lot of people just say, yeah, it's just a band-aid solution, but it doesn't really resolve the issue.
Thank you. Interesting.
We have now Henrik Suder.
Yes, sorry, I'm back. Just yes, just on that, or maybe yeah, different small points touching to these managed entry agreements. It's true that we don't manage anything in those entry agreements. Actually, if you look at the reports from the NIDI, the MORS report, you see that most of these agreements they are just purely financial. It's just a discount, and the objective is just to hide the real price. I mean, that's the condition of the company. I can lower my price only if it's not known anywhere else. So this is nothing to be managed. It's just refunds that you don't want to be shown. And for the other one, where you really have an uncertainty and where you really describe the uncertainty, unfortunately, you were mentioning that most of the time we don't have an answer to the questions at the end of the managed entry agreements. And actually, it really makes sense because if you don't have proofs for efficacy at the moment of entry, most of the time, 3 years afterwards, you don't have a full clinical trial showing you the proper data. I mean, if you were missing the data at the registration level, 3 years after, actually, you don't really have a much better data. I mean, it's really a question of building good clinical trials initially, and it's not few years afterwards that usually bring an answer to the questions. And one thing I also wanted to point about your transparency and communication study, I think it's really coming more and more as a need to communicate on those drugs. And there is a very interesting initiative from the Dutch Minister of Health with their dashboard doorlooptijden, geneesmiddelen. I don't know if you know about this one. And it's okay. They are just publishing where we are in the negotiation of each drug. With at the moment, it's mainly focusing on moments. I mean, where are we in a moment? But this is really thought as a communication tool where they can really explain. Okay, we started negotiating, and then the company didn't agree on a price that were acceptable for us, and this is how it stopped. And this is probably one of the key elements to, as you mentioned, to sometimes stop a drug after a managed entry agreement that doesn't show any improvement, and we are really very often we are stuck in a managed entry agreement because once the drug is on the market, you really need an extremely strong problem in order to stop reimbursement. If you don't have something massive like Translarna, okay, registration was removed. Okay, everybody has to stop. But for the rest, it's extremely difficult to stop.
Yeah, no, I agree. Usually when it's about safety, then it's easier, but then it's also just taken off the market at the EU level. So, and about the price, that's why in my recommendation, I really emphasized on having this collective price negotiations where as countries, if you work together, decide, okay, this is a fair price for this orphan drug. There are some initiatives, and for example, for Orkambi, I think Benelux, at that time, it was just Belgium and Netherlands. They tried to do this, but they failed at the time. But now, maybe if there's more countries involved, it would be easier. Let's see. Yeah, and also for the managed entry agreements, it is. Yeah, I think for cystic fibrosis study as well, we try to look at, is it purely financial based or also for data collection? And a lot of them, okay, it's about the price, but also data collection is very important. That's why it's also important to define the questions upfront, and then at the end of the managed entry agreement, you can more objectively say, okay, you didn't do that. And if you don't have the questions up front, also the company doesn't really know what they have to focus on to gain the data.
Yeah, but I think it's a very important question, and it's true that in many managed entry agreements, the questions are not realistic. We know upfront that there is no way we will have an answer. So yeah, we can very often we request consumption data. This we will have. We will know how much a treatment costs. We will know how many patients. That's going to be easy because that's the data we have automatically. But if you really go into efficacy, and especially for orphan medicines where you have sometimes really no proof at all of efficacy, only improvement of quality of life and stuff like that, there is no way just because Belgium has been requesting it that it will be provided. That's really the key point. So we should be more realistic.
That's why also for the first recommendation I talked about at the EU level, let's say if there is a system where the countries individually where these drugs are used, they collect their data collectively in one system for the EU, then you might have more patients and more data.
Clearly. Yeah, that's obviously a very important point. European registries and maybe the new joint clinical assessments also will open something that they will create some links between countries that will be maybe a tool to address that. And for Benelux, it's true. I mean, it's a really good initiative and it's really the way forward. But today it's really not working because it's still too small. Actually, Benelux, it's still too small to really negotiate properly. But at least they try.
Thank you so much, Anne, for your very interesting comments on the discussion. And actually, indeed, well, it's Benelux, but we also have other examples like the Valletta initiative and DigiCat, and I think many more will lead to lessons learned and will help us to indeed group and make sure that we can have better price negotiations, all in the benefits of the patient and access to medicine. Thank you so much, Khadidja, for explaining what you did during your PhD at Leuven. We really appreciate it. And thank you for the very interesting discussion, Anne and Mathilde. Bye. Bye to all.